So the effect we are going to be creating today is a hologram effect, and this is actually a true 3D hologram. So when looking through the mesh you can see the other side of it showing through. It's quite a long video, but you actually learn how to do the basic technique within the first 8 minutes, and after that it's mainly just learning little extras which can make the render look better, and there's quite a bit of compositing when we bring in all the layers together to give the final effect. So the first thing we're going to do is create the main effect, which is giving the impression of an object being created by light. And then in the second part of the tutorial, we'll be covering lots of little extras which you can add to give a better effect. So the first thing I'm going to do, I've got my normal text object, and it's still in its text form. And I've got a few layers here, and these are acting as my spares. So these are where I've got duplicates of things I need to use. So I'm going to press Shift-D, and then move it to layer 3. And so on layer 3 I can edit this, and I've still got a copy of my text so when I need it later. Now what we're actually going to be doing is getting the text to appear from the bottom upwards, and we're going to be using the explode modifier. And to get a nice mesh, what we're going to do is convert it from a font into a mesh. So object, convert to mesh. So you can see we've got this, and I'll just press W and remove doubles, and you can see it's removed 186, and this will help the remesh modifier, which we're going to use because it's one of the quickest ways to give better topology. So you can see that the 3 has disappeared from our 3D, and that's because we've got removed disconnected pieces. And if you haven't used the remesh modifier before, it will basically try and change all the topology in your mesh into nice quads. And this octree depth is kind of the resolution it will do that at. So at the moment it's a bit too low because it's turned everything a bit jagged. So I'm just going to turn this up to 5, and that should be enough. And then I'm going to apply it. And if we go into edit mode, we can see we've got quite a nice neat mesh, but we have got a few areas which we're going to have to fix, because if we move around we've got these flickering faces, and we're going to correct that by pressing K and using the knife tool. Click that vertice, click the next one, and just turn it into triangles, and it fixes the problem. So you can see we're going to go around the whole mesh and fix these few problems. And why we've done this is because we're going to be making it appear from bottom to top. I want it to appear in nice chunks, and the remesh modifier turns everything into nice rows so it'll appear nicely. Previously when we converted the text it was all triangles and it would have appeared in a very jagged pattern, and this way just gives it a really nice, neat way of appearing. So the next thing we're going to do is create the actual particle system. And now the number of particles are going to be the number of faces in the mesh, which is 1408. And that's because the explode modifier will emit from every face. And so I'm going to set the start time to be 4, the end time to be 34, and you'll see later why I'm doing that, and the lifetime to 250. I'm then going to reduce the normal because effectively these particles will be assigned to faces, and all I want to do is for the faces appear, so they don't need to go anywhere. That means we don't need any physics either. It also means we can turn off the gravity, and I'm also going to put the force at 0 because we're using a force field later and we don't want it to interact. We can then also put the display to none and the render to none because it will render this object by default. So now we've got that set up, we can actually add the explode modifier, and we don't want to see the unborn particles, which are essentially the faces, and so you can see it's come into effect now. And if we go to the beginning and press Alt-A, you can see it's starting to appear, but it's not appearing bottom to top, and that's because we haven't told the particles how they should appear. So I'm just going to go over to the texture tab, and you can see we're on the actual particle tab of the textures. We're going to do a new blend, we're going to set it to vertical, and then the map we're going to use is UV. Now we haven't actually unwrapped it yet, so I'll select everything, U, projection view, bounds, and if we open the UV image editor, clear out the render result, you can see it's stretched the UVs to the limits of the image. And what's going to happen, this blend texture is going to be mapped onto this square, and because it's we've told it to affect the time, where it's black on the texture at the bottom, these will emit first, and so they'll appear first, and where it's white, this will be mapped to the top of the image, and these will emit last. So if we go back to 3D view, into object mode, and back, Alt A, and you can see very quickly it appeared, and that's the effect we want. The next thing I'm going to do is add a quick material. So click New, change it to blue, so this is going to be the colour of our hologram. Turn off the specularity, put the emit up to 1, just make it a bit brighter. We're going to turn on transparency, and that's going to be 0.225. The next thing we're going to do is really the very core of how the effect works. And so for that we're going to add another particle system. I'm going to name this to appear, click the plus icon to add a new one, and this is going to be called lines. And that's because these are going to be the lines that create the light, which is the whole effect of the hologram. So for this to work, we're going to set the emitter to be hair, and you can see it's gone very weird. And there's actually no other settings we need to change on that. But what we do need to do is I'm just going to right click to place a 3D cursor, Shift A, add a mesh, UV sphere, and then I'm going to set this object to be a force field. And I played around with this, and harmonic seemed to work best, and you can already see as soon as I turn that on we're starting to get that effect. And if I just turn that up to about 166, what's actually happened is that the force of the harmonic, which basically says that particles should travel, and in this case to a point on an object, so they're all being drawn into a single point, and that's giving the effect of the hologram light lines. And that obviously may be different to how you're expecting, because a hologram, if you imagine how it might work, is that light would be emitted and create the object. We're actually doing the reverse in that the object is effectively creating the light. And effectively that's the whole technique, and the rest of this tutorial is actually going to be how to add small additions to this effect to just make it look a bit nicer. And there's also going to be a fair amount of compositing at the end. Right, what you may have noticed is that as I went back to the beginning, we seem to have this single hair pointing up to the origin of where our text is. And that's actually because the lines of light grow as the object itself grows with the explode modifier. So you can see these lines appearing as the object does. But when they're kind of not in use, because their faces haven't appeared, they all default to the origin position. And the only way I've found to kind of hide this effect is to move the origin to the actual point they should be going to anyway. So if we do Ctrl-Alt-Shift-C and then choose the origin to the cursor, they've all kind of seemed to disappear, but they're all kind of scrunched in the middle. That doesn't really seem to be a problem when I render it, so I didn't really worry about it too much. Now, as the object builds up, I actually had this kind of wireframe effect, almost as if the hologram was kind of rendering in 3D, and so you kind of see the edges and vertices of the object as it's being built up before this kind of filled object comes in to replace it. And what we're actually going to do is duplicate this whole object that has the lines on it, and then press M to move it to another layer, and this is going to be on layer 1. So now go to layer 1, but we don't actually need the lines on this one, so I'm just going to remove that. But what we do need is this explode modifier. So I'm just going to click this 2 to make it single user. What I'm going to change is that instead of setting it at 4, it's going to start at 1, and instead of 34, it's going to end at 30, and the lifetime is also going to be 4. So if you'll remember, the other particle system settings are set to start 4 frames after this one starts. Now you might not realise what this is actually doing until I change a setting in the explode modifier. We now don't want to see the particles once they've died. So effectively they're appearing, they're lasting for 4 frames, because that's what the lifetime says, and then they're going to disappear again. And this is our actual wireframe effect. So if I click the 2 on the material and just make it a bit darker, so I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm actually going to change the time that the particle starts to be 0, so it's exactly 4 frames before. So if we go through it, you can see what's happening is this blue strip, which is going to be kind of the wireframe effect, is appearing and disappearing, and right after it, and it in fact exactly fits in, our full hologram effect is fitting in. And if I just go into wireframe, you can see the bottom one, which is fitting in, occupies these 3, and this one actually misses these 3, so it is really filling in exactly the gaps. So if I go back to layer 1, I am actually just going to fine tune this material, so we put it back to the brightness that it was. I'm then going to set the emission to be 2, and this is actually also going to be wire, So you can see now we've got a wire effect, and this will render the edges of the mesh. And I'm then also going to put the opacity down to 0.1. And if we just go into camera view and render that, you can see we really are just getting a wireframe effect. But I also want the vertices to appear, and so for that we're going to apply another particle system. So I'm going to go over and click a new one. This is going to be called cubes, because little cubes are going to appear. It's going to emit from the vertices, and we don't want it to be random. Again, they don't need to go anywhere, and there don't need to be any physics. But what it's going to render is going to be an object. So just go into front view, add a new cube, scale it down a bit, go back on and choose cube. And now you can see we've got lots of little cubes appearing. And then this cube can also have a material, and it can have one that's the same as the first one. And we're not seeing the full effect of them, so I'm going to get them all to emit on the first frame and have a lifetime of 250. And so now we're seeing almost little vertices on each of the points where vertices should be. And actually, we're not actually getting all of them. I don't really know why they don't all appear, so I'm just going to put the number up to 1500, and you can see we're getting a lot more now. So if I just give that a render, you can see we're starting to see them. And I'm just going to reduce the size of them a bit, because they're a bit big. So you can see we're getting a nice wireframe effect. And if I actually combine that with layer 3, we're starting to build the effect up, and there's going to be quite a few more layers yet, and then we'll take them all into the compositor to finalize the effect. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to go back to our spares layer, Shift E to duplicate, press escape, and then move by pressing M onto layer 2. And this one is going to be some bright outlines that just give highlights to the text, because currently it's looking a bit plain, but we still need that amount of opacity. And the way to fix that is to create some extra outlines. And the way we're going to do that, we're going to convert it this time into curves. So if we tab into edit mode, we can see it's all being converted to curves. But what we're going to do is remove the extrude, and then we're going to add a bevel object. So to do that, if you haven't done it before, we're going to do Shift A, add a curve circle. I'm then going to reduce the resolution of this curve quite a bit. And then selecting our main object again, you can see it's already come up. It's the only object that you can use because it's the only other curve, and everything goes a bit weird. And that's because this bevel object is far too big. So if I scale this down, we'll start to see the effect. And we can scale it down to about that size. Then what we're going to do, we're going to bring back layer 1. I'm going to go into top view, and then I'm just going to go into edit mode, select everything, and move this curve to the back, because this is going to represent the back of the text, making sure everything's selected. Shift D, moving it on the y-axis, move it to the front, tab out of edit mode, and you can start to see what we're creating. But I want to create some extra lines just to kind of join these two curves together. So to do that, we're going to go into side view, tab into edit mode. I'm going to press Shift A and add a Bezier, and you can see it's added this curve. We're just going to select these both SZ0 to flatten them out, and then we're just going to move them over so that they fit the width. So we're going to move this handle so it's in at the edge. We're lining it up with this front edge, and we're going to scale it down because if they overlap, things get a bit weird. And then we're going to move this into the back and scale this one down. And then just pressing L so I can easily select what's connected to them. In front view, I'm just going to move them to the parts where I want this line to be. So then I'm going to Shift D, duplicate, and then the last one over in the corner. If we tab out of edit mode, we can see we're getting a more of a 3D effect, and it just helps to give definition to your text, because when we make it turn, it can be a bit hard to see, and these outlines just help it. So now we'll sort their material out, and it's going to be the same as the first one. We're going to make it a single user so we can just change some options, and this time it's going to have a brightness of 2 just to make everything a bit brighter. And if we enable the other layers and we render that, you can see what we're starting to get. You can see the main body of the hologram is actually a bit washed out, and this just gives a bit of extra definition. and it just helps so we can see it better. Of course, this will all be optimized in the compositor later. It doesn't really matter if the color is a bit washed out now, because we'll just change it later. But what we're going to do next is you'll notice that really these parts shouldn't be visible because it's still only building the bottom part. So we're going to add a fade out effect so these fade in as the rest of the mesh gets created. And to do that, we're going to do it with the texture. First, we need to set the transparency all the way to 0 because we're going to be getting a texture to control the transparency. So I've clicked New Texture, Blend, it's going to be vertical. We're going to use UV mapping, so I'll just go back to its layer, front view, and the same as last time. But I'm going to do Object, Convert to Mesh, and now that bevel object has now been applied. And what this means is that we can UV unwrap it and create this fade out effect. So we'll do projection view with bounds like last time. And again, what's going to happen, so this image is going to be mapped onto this square, so at the bottom it's going to be black, and this will affect the transparency, which we'll see in a minute. What I want to then do, we don't want it to affect the colour, I want it to affect the alpha, and I want the maximum it can ever be to be 0.5. We'll click both so we can see what's going on. You can see we're getting a fade out effect already, thanks to that gradient. Where it's black, it's being solid, and where it's white, it's being transparent. Now, I don't really understand the way it works. I think the preview is actually working upside down to the way it's going to act in the render, which is a bit weird and threw me a bit when I was making this. But anyway, it seems to work. We'll expand the Colors tab, and we'll click Ramp, and we're going to customize this a bit to be the colours we want. So just by swapping them around, you can see we're starting to affect this. If I move it all the way here, it's disappeared. So if I render that right now, you see we can only see the very bottom of it. And if I move that over to the right, and that over to the right, we can see it all. So if we animate this slope, we can animate the gradient of transparency. So I just show you what it looks like halfway along. So really, according to this preview, the top half should be solid and the bottom half transparent, but if we actually render it, we get the opposite result. But it is what we want, so we just have to remember it's going to be upside down. And what I'm going to do is go back to the beginning, and we're actually going to keyframe these values. So I click the first one, the white one. I'm going to press I over the value to make sure it's keyframed, and select the black slider, press I, so that's keyframed. We're going to tab out of edit mode and bring back one of our other layers to help us, so we know what stage it should be completed. So we know at about frame 34 it should be all the way solid, so we'll move the sliders all the way over to the other side, as far as we can get them, and then we'll press I, and we'll select the other one, and we'll press I. So if we go somewhere in between, the object should be half transparent, and that's what we're getting. Now of course you can fine tune this even more, and actually if you move them a bit apart, if I just keyframe that new value, we render that. So if we bring back layer 1, we render it all together, we get this effect, and that's most of the layers created for the text. What I'm going to show you now is something I've already made, because it's a very basic object, and it's on layer 4, and this is really just a disk, and it represents the light where all these light beams are actually going to be emitted. And you can see I've got a particle system which is set to hair. All I've done, I've got 500, even distribution, and I've just played around with the normal values which affect the length, the tangent which affects the angle, and the randomness which gives it a random angle. And this is rendered with a white emit. And you can see I've animated the emit so that at the beginning it flickers on and off. It's flicking between the value 0 and 2, and that just gives the impression that it's kind of turning on and kind of warming up before it starts displaying. On layer 5 I then have a duplicate of this, and all that's different, it doesn't have the hair system, and that's because it's going to be used in the compositing. Now that we've got most of it together, we'll do the very small bit of animation that I had in the scene. So we'll make sure we can see all the layers. By holding Shift, I'll just scroll through them, and then I'll do Shift A, and we're going to add an empty, and we'll move it up above. I'm then going to duplicate it and move it above that one. And one is going to control the rotation, and one is going to control the up and down motion, and it's not really necessary to create two, it just gives a bit of extra control. So the next thing we're going to do, and you have to make sure you're in a part of the timeline where you can see all of the objects, because obviously at some points one object has disappeared, and then other points the other object has disappeared, so make sure you're at a point where you can see all three different types of mesh. I'm going to wireframe and box select them. So we've got our three meshes selected, and we're going to parent them to this one by pressing Ctrl P and do Object. Now one thing I just want to point out, that you really don't have to use text, you can use any mesh. So if you want to create a car that appears by a hologram, it'll still work, because remember, it's being emitted from the mesh and not kind of to the mesh. Anyway, we can now keyframe this empty, and this is going to be for the rotation. So I'm just going to get to a point where it's fully appeared, and then I'm going to right click and do Insert Single Keyframe, and then we'll move to maybe frame 120, and I'm going to put in minus 720, Insert Single Keyframe, and if we give that a playthrough, we'll see what we've got. And you can see as it turns, the hair follows it. And then just pressing this back arrow, we can go to the first keyframe. We'll select this and do I location, and then selecting this, we'll go to the other keyframe and do I location, and then somewhere in the middle we'll just move it down. We'll do I location, and then we'll go back to the first keyframe and just parent this one, which is controlling the rotation, to this one, which is controlling the location. Press Ctrl P, Object. If we play through, we can just see it bobs up and down as it's rotating. Now, you may not want to have this bob, I just imagined that it would kind of bob up and down as it was being generated. Now, one thing I'm actually going to do is selecting our main text, and that's the main mesh. I'm going to go over to the lines particle system, and I'm actually going to turn off the emission on the render settings, and that basically means that the object won't be rendered. And we're going to do the same on this one. We don't want the emitter to appear in the render, and that's because actually it's not going to be rendered in this scene, it's going to be rendered in a different scene, but we still need it in this scene to create all the hair effects, and it made sense to kind of create it in this scene. But we're actually going to be moving it into my other scene, which is labelled Indirect Lighting. In here I have a basic background, and I have a little base which represents where the hologram light is, and this is kind of where the hologram's being emitted from, and it pairs up with that little light I made in the other scene. And it has a material on it, and all that material is a texture, and I'll just reload it. And it's an HDR image that I blurred, and it's actually mapped to the reflection of the object, and that's just because it was looking a bit plain, so I wanted to give it some fake reflections, and so by mapping it onto reflection, it'll kind of create a nice effect. Now the reason we've got this scene, and it's called Indirect Lighting, is because we're going to be using Indirect Lighting so that the hologram can light its scenery. Selecting our main hologram text, I'm going to press Ctrl L, Objects to Scene, I'm going to choose Indirect Lighting. And what this does, it moves it to the other scene, or at least makes a linked copy. So if we look on this third layer, we can see it, and it doesn't need the hair. But before we remove them, if we click on this object, you can see it has a blue origin, and that means it is linked. So on the object, I'm just going to press that to make it a single user. Then I'm going to remove the lines, because we don't need them in this scene. Now if I hadn't unlinked them, it would have removed the lines from the text in this scene as well, because they were linked. But because I unlinked them and then removed, it remains in this one, but isn't in the other one. So remember, we're not having it render in here. We've moved it into here, and because it has an emit shading value, so it's going to emit light, it's going to cast light onto the surrounding object. Now the reason why we don't have indirect lighting turned on in the main scene is that for some reason the hair particles really don't like indirect lighting. I'm not really sure, but they just slowed the render down, so it was impossible to render. So we're just going to render what is necessary to render in here, and then we'll combine them later. So if we go back to the world settings, we can now enable indirect lighting. I'm going to put it up to 2 to emphasize the effect and make sure it's on approximate because it'll only work on that. And then actually I'm going to, because I turned off the emitter to appear, it's not appearing. So I'm going to press the 2 to make this particle system a single user and actually make sure it's appearing under the render settings because it does need to appear in this scene. So you can see it's appearing. Just out of sight is that little kind of portal which is creating the hologram, and you can see we're casting light onto the background. And because the object's going to be moving, you're going to notice that the light is changing on the background. Now one thing I need to do is actually link in these empties, because they need to be in the scene as well if they're going to make it rotate. So press Ctrl L and send them to the indirect lighting. So we switch back, they're on this layer. You can see it's now parented properly. And so this rotation will match the rotation in here if you're on the right frame. So the movement will be correct, so we can match them correctly in the compositor. Now it may have been a bit confusing as to why we've got the two scenes, so just to go over it again. The indirect lighting, which we need so that the hologram can cast light onto its surroundings, didn't like to work with these hair particles, so I created a separate scene and a linked object so we can cast them in here and then combine everything in the compositor later. So the last thing we're going to do before we start the compositing is actually set up our render layers. So over in layers, layer 1 is going to be wireframe, so that's our wireframe mesh, which is on layer 1. We don't need to render the sky. New layer, and now light lines. Now these are the lines that actually come from that little light, and they are on layer 4, and they don't need the sky. And then we've got the actual hologram lines, which make up the main effect, and they are on layer 3. We don't need the sky. Then we've got that outline layer, which is the outline of text. And the reason why I'm doing all these different layers is because they all need different effects when they're in the compositor. And that is on layer 2, and that doesn't need the sky. And then our last render layer is going to be the actual light. You can't really see it because it's off screen, but we'll change the camera in a minute. And that is on layer 5. And that doesn't need the sky. I'm then just going to go into our indirect lighting scene. I'm going to move our main text onto layer 1, and then move this little portal onto layer 2, and then we're going to have two layers. One's called main, it's going to be layer 1, no sky, and the second layer is going to be background, and that will only be layer 2, and that will need the sky. So now we've got all our render layers set up, we're going to go into the compositor and add them all together. So there's a few things I want to do before we start the compositing, and one of those things is setting this to smooth shading. And then it's gone a bit weird, so we're going to add one more modifier, and that's the edge split, and it's still going to look a bit weird, but it will look a bit better. So we're going to leave it like that, and I'm then going to go into our main scene, and just on the camera layer, I'm going to move the camera down so we can see the light base just at the bottom here. I'm then going to press Ctrl L and link it into our other scene. You can see it's appeared here, and I'm just going to press Ctrl 0, so we set this to be the active camera. And then we're on frame 83 here, but I want to be on a frame where we can see it appearing, and then I'm just going to make sure we're on the same frame in the other scene so the compositing works out. And then I'm going to give it a render. So we've done that one, and I'm on 50%, so going into our other scene and making sure we're on the same settings, I'm also going to render this. And now we should be ready to start the compositing. So if you don't already have this up, you just need to click the composite icon here and use nodes and backdrop. I'm then going to do Shift A and add an output viewer so we can see what we're doing. And then the first layer we're going to link in is going to be from our main scene, and it's going to be our outline. And if I just link that to the output viewer, we can see our outline, and that's because we had it on a separate layer. Now the first things we're going to do to this, we're going to add a blur, and there's going to be quite a few blurs. And I'll link that up, and we're going to change it to a fast Gaussian, and we're going to change it to relative so that even when we render at 100%, the blur will stay the same size relative to how it should be, rather than expanding the image up to 100%, and it may appear smaller because we're rendering more pixels, but this will just fix that and make sure it always stays the same size. So this is going to be 1 and 1, and then we're going to do Shift A, color mix, link that in, and then we're going to mix it with the original, and we're going to change it to add and a value of maybe 0.5. If I just zoom in with Alt V, we can see what it's done. So if I press M to disable this, you can see it's added the glow at the top. And that may be a bit much, so 0.25. And I'll switch these round. And that seems to be good enough. I'll then add in a color hue and saturation node. And I'm just going to boost the brightness a bit to help it stand out when we add the other layers. And then we're going to add in our second render layer. And this is going to be from the Indirect Lighting scene. And it's going to be our main layer. You might be able to see in the thumbnail view we've got our 3D text. And we're going to add that in using an alpha over node. So Shift A, color, alpha over. And then we're going to link that in. And you can see it's added them together over the top. The next thing we're going to do is another blur. So I'm just going to duplicate this one because it's only a few settings we're going to change. I'm going to turn this blur down to 0.5 and 0.5. And then we're going to do the same thing as we did over here. So I'll duplicate this node. And we're going to add it over the top of its original unblurred self. So I've just swapped these two inputs because they were the wrong way around. And so we're just going to put that up to about 0.5. And you can see it's blurred the whole thing and there's a slight border. If I just press M to disable, you can see it's just adding a very subtle glow around everything now. We'll then add in our third render layer, and this is going to be from the main scene, and it's going to be our wireframe. And we're again going to use add to mix them together. So I'll zoom out a bit and plug it in. And you can see it's added over the top. And so what we're going to do is then blur this on its own, so it has its own blur. So we're not blurring anything else, just the wireframe, and it's disappeared. So we're going to then copy the hue and saturation and boost its color a bit. So we're actually going to mix in the non-blurred version, so we've got it there, and then using another add, we'll then add in the blurred version. And I'm then going to go and fine tune this other hue and saturation because it's a bit too much. And I'm also going to fine tune this blur so it's a bit smaller. So now it's not quite so intense. So we added in a non-blurred version of the wireframe, and then we added in a blurred version over the top. And if I just disable this, you can see the effect. And I've just made sure this is set to 1. So the next thing we're going to do is add in the lines for the light that's going to produce the hologram at the bottom. So Shift A, input render layer, and this will be our light lines. And just to see it, we'll put an output viewer. So like we did before, I'm going to duplicate this blur and set it to 1 and 1. So it's quite a big blur. And then we're going to use something I haven't used before, which is directional blur, because we want to blur it directly up. I'm going to set it to 0.024. You can see it's blurred it sideways. So we're going to alter the angle to 90 degrees, and it's blurring it up. And then I'm going to set the iterations to 4, just to smooth out this problem we're getting at the edge. And then we're going to add in our other render layer, so I'm just going to duplicate this one, change it to the actual light this time, and then I'm going to duplicate this twice, and link them both into the same one. This one is going to be a smaller blur of 0.25, 0.25, and this one is going to be a bigger one of 1. And then we'll add them together with color mix. Set them to add, and then connect it to the viewer. So you can see, if I disable this bigger blur, actually it's having no effect, so I'm going to boost that up to 0.5 and 0.5, so it's just softening the edges, and then the big blur is coming in and doing that. And I'm actually going to put this up to 1.5 and 1.5. We're then going to add these two sections together with another add. So you can see we've added the two together, so we're getting the blur of the base and the blur of the lights going upwards. And you can always increase that directional blur. and I'm going to reduce that to 0.7, so it's not quite so strong. So we're actually fading out the blurred light that's going up and bringing back more of the base, so we get more of that elliptical shape. We're then going to give it a bit of colour, and I'm going to do that with a multiply node. So colour mix, set it to multiply, and then we're just going to change this to a bit of blue, and it just gives it a bit of a blue tint. And then finally another colour mix, and we're going to mix this first section with this second light section. So you can now see we've joined both of our sections, and the next thing we're going to do is add in a few of our remaining layers, making sure we're bringing the composite node along with us, because that's what everything has to connect to if we want it to render. So we're going to bring in our indirect lighting background, from the indirect lighting scene, background, and we're going to use an alpha over, so Shift A color, alpha over, to add these two together. And actually I think the texture is missing from this base that I made, so I'm just going to go and refine the file and then re-render. So I went and updated it with the image, and you can see with the fake reflection it kind of makes it look like chrome, and it's a lot better than what it was looking like. But one thing we could do, just switch around the alpha over so that our hologram is on top, and you can see we're just steadily bringing these elements together. And so one of the last things to do is add in our actual hologram lines. So I will duplicate the render layer, and from the main scene, hologram lines, I'll link them to the output viewer. And I think a slight error we're getting is that I think perhaps our sphere that is a force field is being rendered, and also we're seeing the bits at the bottom, so we're going to mask them out. So we'll go back to the 3D view, find our sphere, press Ctrl H to make sure it's not being rendered, and then in our render layers, for hologram lines, I'm going to make sure it's going to be masked by layer 5. And if you remember, on layer 5 we've got this, and this is just going to mask out the bottom part of those lines because we don't really want to see them. And then I'll give that a render, and then we'll get back to the compositing. So now we've got the updated hologram lines, and you can see they're being cut off. We've got one coming out here, but I don't think we'll see it, and that's just because we're using a mask layer, which is very useful. So what we're going to do, may not be surprised, we're going to add a blur, fast Gaussian relative, set it to 1 and 1, and then we're going to duplicate this alpha over, as that's how we're going to add them together. And then we'll just swap them around, and you can see we've got our light lines. So now I'm going to zoom out so we can see everything, and you can see we're not seeing that that kind of stray line that was coming out, so that's not a problem. And then I'm just going to bring in a hue and saturation node, because I've just found that boosting the colour of the lines at the last minute really helps. So I'm just going to boost that, and you can see it's really starting to kind of illuminate, and you can see the lines coming up all the way. And so there we have it. And as long as you make sure your final node is connected to your composite, and make sure you have compositing on in post-processing tab, it will render out. Because we set all the blur nodes to use relative, even if we increase to 100%, the blurs will stay the correct size in proportion to the image, and we've done quite a bit of compositing. But because we broke it down into sections and added them together, it all worked out alright, and I hope it wasn't too complicated for everyone. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial, and if you like it, please say so in the comments. If you want to see more stuff like this, then please subscribe, and if you have any questions, you can always contact me on Twitter or via my email address. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.